This is the ESPN Aussie Hoops Hour. Kane Pittman alongside Olgun with plenty to discuss after the Paris Olympic squads for the Boomers, the Opals, and the 3x3 team have been dropped. And Olgs, if I go on social media, there is a lot of conversation, a little bit of frustration. Of course, as always, a lot of debate. So we're going to particularly get into the Boomers on this podcast and some of the names that missed out, some of the names that are there, and some of the reaction and the emotion that we've seen. I think it's absolutely fascinating, particularly now that we know the Boomers have their group. Spain and Greece also punching their ticket there. So we're going to get into that. You spoke to Gorge. You were around this team in Melbourne for the last week, so you are the perfect man to break this all down with. Before we get into that, we like some housekeeping. You want to watch on ESPN the next week or so here with the Boomers. They're going to have warm-up games against Team USA and also Serbia. You can catch them on ESPN, so make sure you check out the times there wherever you are. And as far as the Opals go, if you're interested in finding out and learning a lot more about an equally difficult decision to bring yourself to the final 12 for the Opals, they were very, very impressive in Melbourne. The head coach, Sandy Brondello, is going to join us on SportsCenter Wednesday morning Australian time. So if you can't watch the show Wednesday morning on ESPN, you can check it on the ESPN social platforms and digital platforms there as well, because we're going to continue to ramp up the Opals coverage, and they look very, very good. The 3x3 team, we love the fact that they've got a very talented squad and they're in medal contention, but we also love the fact that my man Damon Lowry is the head coach of that team, and he's going to be over there in Paris. And Damon, I know you like listening to the podcast. I will go for a run with you in Paris. I don't know how long I'm going to last, but I will go on a run with you. But Ogs, the Boomers, you've been busy. I think I know which direction you'll go when I ask you this. What stands out to you, or where do you want to start? So many talking points that I can't wait to get into with you.
It's the thing that I think most people in the general Australian public are not pleased about. And that's probably putting it lightly, that they're not pleased. And that's Matisse Thybulle not being part of this team. That was a surprise to everyone involved, to some players, to the sort of former Boomer, the Boomers fraternity, to the general public, to us in the media. There was no real sense that Matisse Thybulle was going to miss this team. When I was building my team, Matisse Thybulle was a starter. So the fact that he was left off the team completely was a shock. That's obviously the biggest one. And then the other one for me is Xavier Cooks, actually. And I don't know if people are talking about that enough because of the Thybulle thing. But Xavier Cooks not being on this team, he was a point of difference. He is a piece athletically that this team could have used. And now that we know the full pool that Australia's going to be in, they've got to go up against Giannis Antetokounmpo. And there aren't many bodies that Australia can throw at Giannis, considering Greece does have size elsewhere. So Greece has a lot of big bodies that they're going to throw at you, and Australia doesn't have a lot of huge bodies to throw back at them. So that's the most interesting part of this squad for me. And how do you want to do this? Do you want to go? There are a lot of sort of Matisse Thybulle. There are a lot of interesting parts of it, and then there are a lot of like flow-on effects from it. So where do you want to start with the Thybulle thing, or do you want to talk about some of the others first?
No, Thybulle, I think, is quite honestly why a lot of people will be tuning into this podcast. So I think it's a good place to start. And I think that the flow-on conversation is then how the roster was built, because I think more so than the individual names, I've been surprised at how big they've lent into this squad, and not necessarily big in the idea of, okay, who are the guys that can play the mobile four, but genuine bigs that I'm not sure if it feels like it really trends with the way that the game's been going and some of the teams are going to play. So I was fascinated by the makeup of this squad. But with Matisse Thybulle, it's interesting because I said this on Nothing But Net a few days ago on ESPN. I agree with you. I had Matisse Thybulle as one of the first picked, and there was reasons for that, and perhaps none more so to NBA fans that maybe have their opinion and have seen Matisse Thybulle a little bit, but there actually isn't another player individually with the credentials that Matisse Thybulle has when you just consider that he's a two-time all-defensive player. So unless I'm blanking on someone, there's no one that has those types of individual awards. Now, you can weight that as much as you want, but when you're going up against the best offensive players in the world, you would think someone that twice has been rated in the top 10 defensive players in the NBA, you would think that that's a valuable skill set, particularly when you have heard that defense was the big takeaway, that it wasn't up to scratch at the World Cup last year. So that's why it surprised me. That's why I expected him to be there. And then perhaps just emotionally, I think the other reason why I thought he was going to be there is just because of how much. Now, I don't know how much this can weight selection, but how much Matisse Thybulle has bought in emotionally to playing for Australia and invested in a really valuable slot in this squad where you can only have one naturalized player on the roster. And he's been all in from the start. And it hasn't just been a token, I just want to go to the Olympics. He's bought into playing for Australia, has become such a fan favorite as well, which I think draws into the emotion. So if you said to me that you were concerned about the defense of the Boomers, it's kind of a head scratcher that you wouldn't have Matisse Thybulle in the lineup, though, even though at the World Cup, he was 9th in minutes per game on this squad. So if you watched the World Cup and you saw the positional crossover, you were wondering where all these defensive pieces fit. And we discussed it in the post-game after the last World Cup game. So I think there was trending towards this way. I still didn't expect it.
Yeah, so let's dive into it. It was ultimately when this decision was made, and I'm pretty confident that this decision was last minute. Right? This came down to the wire for a lot of these spots. It came down between Matisse Thybulle and Dyson Daniels when it came to which one of those sorts of players is going to be part of that core nine. Right there, I think Gorge and that coaching staff came up with a core 9 guys, and then they wanted to figure out which 3 players would then tack on the end of that roster. So that core 9, and we might as well go through the team in naming that core 9. From what I understand and what I figure, it's Giddy, Green, Exum, Paddy, Dyson Daniels, Dante, I said Exum already, Jock Landau, Dorp, Reed, Nick Kay, and Jack McVeigh. There are 9 guys there, right? And my feel is that they go into the tournament as like the main rotation in some way or another. And then on the end of that, the last 3 picks in my mind were Will Magnay, Joe Ingles, and Matthew Dellavedova. So as far as Gorge is concerned, I think he looked at that core 9 and he thought, we have that skill set covered, right? They lent into Dyson Daniels over Matisse Thybulle. I think they trust Dyson Daniels more as a point of attack defender than they do Matisse Thybulle as a point of attack defender. Maybe Thybulle is better as a defender in other aspects of that part of the game. But I think at the point of attack, I think they like what Dyson Daniels does. I think if you ask around the NBA, they would probably agree with that sentiment too, that Dyson Daniels is probably more preferable at the point of attack. So once that was decided, that it was Dyson over Matisse as that defensive wing guy that's not named Josh Green or Dante Exum in that core 9, then it was, what do we fill the rest of the roster out with? What does spot number 10, 11, and 12 look like? And maybe this is the coaching staff thinking a little bit too deeply about it and thinking, all right, the 10th spot, we need a third big. They decided that on day 1. So that was Will Magnay, right? So they lent into that right away. They knew that as soon as they hit the first day of training camp that we're going to bring a third big, and Will Magnay was the only other big on that roster, and he fits a skill set that they like too. He's a rim runner. He's tough. He gets up and down the floor. And then it's, all right, we want some toughness. And that toughness is Matthew Dellavedova. Again, toughness can be a platitude, but they felt it was something that was missing from the World Cup that they had in Tokyo. And so Matthew Dellavedova ticked that box. So he was on the team. He's someone who, everyone out there, don't be surprised if he gets minutes on this team. They like his toughness. They like his ability in spot minutes to pick up 94 feet, to then have some creation on the other end too. That's that. And then the last spot was Joe Ingles, who was sort of on the outer going into game 2. And then in the second half, he showed a little bit of creation. The offense was a little bit stagnant. He came on, steadied the ship. He guided things a little bit. Came off on balls, found Jock Landau. So that was the last spot. So there were some boxes they wanted to tick with those last 3 spots. And once that core 9 was full, they didn't feel like Matisse Thybulle ticked those boxes of, those last 3 sort of role guys more than the ones who they ultimately ended up picking. Now, I will say, from what I understand, this wasn't a consensus among the coaches. There was some disagreement within the coaching staff on whether or not to take Matisse Thybulle, because there is a completely reasonable frame of thought that, okay, we have 3 spots to fill at the end of a bench. Let's say our core is finished. There's probably room for one of the best defenders in the world. You can make room for him, because there may be moments where someone's in foul trouble or someone gets injured, and you may need to throw that guy out there, right? Even if you had soured on Matisse Thybulle as part of your main rotation, there's probably room in that team for him, whether that's in expense of Joe Ingles or Matthew Dellavedova or a third big. And And I honestly think, again, I think the same could be said about Xavier Cooks. I think the same could be said about Chris Golding. I think the big surprise, though, is the fact that it was Matisse out and it wasn't one of those other guys in, because Cooks is that athletic point of difference and Chris Golding is that shooting point of difference. So if you're not going to bring what most of us thought was a likely lock in Matisse Thybulle, you'd think that you'd bring that shooting insurance or that athletic insurance in Xavier Cooks. I think what has most people a little bit unpleased and concerned is the fact that they lent into some of the older guys, some of the former guys, like a Matthew Dellavedova. They went back to a Joe Ingles, as opposed to sort of moving on, getting more athletic or becoming better on the perimeter.
Yeah, so on the first point, just with Dyson Daniels, and look, I understand it's been a little bit challenging to watch the Pelicans games, perhaps, but I already think that Dyson Daniels, even if the minutes went down, I already think he's at the level defensively of Matisse Thybulle. I just think he's that good. I don't think that his minutes dropped in the postseason because of his ability to play. I think the Pelicans didn't have Zion Williamson. I think they were desperate for offense, and that was the main reason that Dyson got squeezed. So I already think he is a guy that, as long as he is going to continue to play, which we think he will, I think he'll be an all-defense guy down the road. I think he's that good still at the young age. So it's, even if you're comparing Thybulle to Daniels, I think it's a fine comparison. I think it's a fine swap. But wouldn't you want more of those guys with an elite world-class skill set? I think that's where it's confusing to me, because if you say we want this to be a defense-first team that is athletic and gets up and run, then wouldn't you want more of those guys? So I don't doubt that Dyson Daniels can fill the Matisse Thybulle role. I think he absolutely can, and I think he's ready to do it because we've seen some of his elite defense at the NBA. But if you weren't going to take Matisse Thybulle, there is a few questions that I would have. Well, what is someone else that has an elite skill set? Is it a Chris Golding that is an elite outside shooter that this team really kind of doesn't have anymore, in a world where if you're not hitting bulk threes, you struggle to win games? So that was a head scratcher for me. And then the other point was, that I wasn't big on taking the third center, but it was very clear, as you pointed to, everything you were hearing was like, okay, well, Magnay's going to be going. So then I'm like, well, if you want to be an athletic team and you want to be a team that gets up and down, then I would have just assumed that Nick Kay wouldn't have been there and Xavier Cooks would probably go, because that would seem to fit the mold of the basketball you're trying to play. Because I'm not sure, and I might be proven wrong, and I hope that I'm very wrong, but when I spoke with Trevor Gleason last week on one of our ESPN shows, he kind of was of the idea that you could play Landau and Reith together and even start them together. I don't know about that. Only because of a Canada team that's going to be pretty small, really. If you looked at the weakness of that team, it would probably be size. Even if you're looking at Greece, Giannis is going to be playing the four. He's going to be playing some of the five. So I don't know if you want the two big guys at the 4-5. So then to me, you are leaning into a Xavier Cooks, or you're leaning into, he might not be the most athletic guy, but a guy that can spark the offense and run the offense and bring variety in Joe Ingles. Do you just stretch the floor and have more of those athletic defensive guys, Thybulle, Green, and also Daniels in the same lineup? So that's what surprised me more than anything, and I hope I'm very wrong about it. But the makeup of the team seems to be shifting bigger. On paper, at least, to me, it doesn't seem to really fit what we thought the talking points were coming into the World Cup from the squad. That's why I was surprised.
That's the most confusing thing about it, is the fact that we've spoken to Gorge sort of in publicly, privately, and everything he's been broadcasting, everything I think everyone's been broadcasting has been that this team will play fast. That I think Gorge mentioned Aussie ball, and I think the idea was this is that we're not trying to play like Europeans. We're not trying to play like Team USA. We have a certain set of guys and they have a certain set of skill sets, and we have to lean into those things. And the assumption, and I think it was pretty explicit too, that this is going to be an athletic team, that they're going to try and get shots up quickly, run the floor, be really basically focus on the defensive end and try to push the ball, right? And so the fact that they were missing defense at the World Cup. There was a significant drop-off from Tokyo to the World Cup. And they were missing shooting from the World Cup. And these were two things that were noted publicly. And the fact that it seems as though they haven't necessarily lent into the entirety of those skill sets that they were purportedly missing. I think that's the part that confuses a lot of people. I think everyone will also don't be surprised when Nick Kay starts games. Nick Kay
started at the World Cup.
Nick Kay going into the Paris Olympics is the prospective starter at the 4. So don't be surprised if that happens. I also expect Dyson Daniels to start. But what I imagine the starting lineup is going to be is Giddey, Green, Daniels, Kay, and Jock Landale. I don't know how I feel about playing the 2 bigs at the same time. I don't see a world where the Boomers coaching staff goes that direction, mainly because I don't see other teams doing it.
Yeah, but that's the thing. So I'll be the first to acknowledge Brian Goorjian, the coaching staff, Trevor Gleeson, significantly smarter basketball minds than me. But I'm saying that I can't see it. But if they are saying, and you look at the squad, it seems that they're leaning that way. So even if I sit here and say, well, I'm a little bit surprised that that's the path they're going down, I got to admit, I'm pretty fascinated to see how these lineup combinations go, because if that many people that say what you want, there's a lot of criticism out there from the couches. These are very, very smart basketball people, and they're leaning big. That's got me intrigued.
Oh, it's weird though, because so let's say Greece, right? I think Greece is like the easy matchup to look at. There's a good chance that they start Giannis at the 4 and then Papagiannis at the 5. So you've got Giannis, who is the most dominant, bigger player in the game right now, right? From an athletic and physical standpoint. And then you have Papagiannis, who's like a legitimate 7-1. Do you start both your bigs, or do you trust in Nick Kay to take the Giannis matchup? Now it sounds a bit simplistic just to say Nick Kay on Giannis and go to work and do your best. It's largely going to be team defense and things like that. When it comes to team defense and, shrinking the floor against Giannis, I think you probably want someone like Matisse Thybulle out there to play the passing lanes and to be that roamer and things like that.
Yeah.
But this is what they're leaning into. And then when you think of who the backups are, right? Like let's say it goes from Nick Kay to Jack McVeigh. Obviously, there's a drop off defensively there, a big uptick offensively. But the thing that I think this team's going to want to keep is spacing, because there isn't much of that, right? It's why Nick Kay made it over Xavier Cooks, because he brings a little bit of a spacing element that Xavier Cooks doesn't. Unfortunately, that was the only thing that really left Xavier Cooks off this team, was the fact that he can't shoot the ball. Duop Reith can shoot it. Jack McVeigh can shoot it. But yeah, the lack of shooting specialists scare me. But to your point, I don't know if going big is the way to go. And I don't think it's the way that they're leaning either, because we saw in these warm-up games, and yes, they're warm-up games against China, and we'll learn more when this Boomers team plays the USA and Serbia in the exhibition games next week. But they were okay playing anyone at the 4. They put Dante at the 4. They put Dyson Daniels at the 4. They just made it work. So they're going to lean into that same style. Again, the Thybulle thing is that they felt they had all their pieces already when it came to their core rotation, and they just wanted to fill other spots. And look, Delhi is going to get spot minutes. I think the thinking was, if we've got 5 minutes to throw out there, let's say 2 minutes at the end of the first and 2 minutes at the end of the third, who do we trust out there? I think they trust the idea of Matthew Dellavedova maybe coming on, bringing a spark defensively, picking up 94 feet, diving on someone's legs. That's the sort of thing that they want from someone like a Matthew Dellavedova.
So here's my thing when you talk about spacing. And first of all, because all these guys that made the team, I've even seen, arguments that Daly shouldn't be there. Everyone that's in this squad, we said this before they picked the team, everyone that was in this squad in this final 14, 15, you could easily make a case for why they're there. And Daly, you can easily make a case because he was good in the NBL last year. A year ago when he didn't make the World Cup squad, he hadn't played for the 12 months prior to that. So it's a completely different scenario. I think that if you are talking about him, and if he is the 12th guy, the perfect guy to be there, because he's been there before. You can throw him in there for 5-10 minutes and shake things up. So I didn't even have a problem with that. And I don't have a problem with Nick Kay because he's been so great over the last few tournaments. So it feels like I'm picking on that spot, but it's more positionally rather than the names. And if you're saying, well, they would have gone with him for spacing, this has been my whole argument with the specialist shooters from the start. You have to have guys that are actually going to go out there and shoot threes, because if you want the defense to care about the guys on the perimeter that are the quote unquote floor spacers, they have to be really willing shooters that are still going to shoot the ball, even if they are being guarded, and they're going to force the defense to guard them. And Nick Kay can hit threes, no question. But if you go to last year's World Cup, where he started and played 24 minutes a game, he got up 1.8 threes per game. If you want to go back to Tokyo, where again, he played 28 minutes per game, he only got up 2 threes per game. So he's not a guy, if you putting him out there for floor space. And to me, he's not a guy that's going to change what the defense is doing and be like, wow, they got a floor space in 4 out there. We better be careful out in the perimeter. That's not going to be the case. And Chris Goulding would have been there. And when I see people say, well, you can't play Chris Goulding because you can't play defense, I say, all right. But if you go back to Tokyo and you look at Chris Goulding's game log, the 3 games that he progressively played more minutes, the quarterfinal, the semifinal, and then the bronze medal game, where he played his most minutes of the tournament. In each of those games, he hit multiple threes. That's valuable for a team to me still that I look at, and I'm concerned about the offense.
Yeah, the whole they don't play defense thing, I get it, but also Patty Mills is not a great defender. Joe Ingles is not a great defender right now. I get they're net negative on that end, but there's a value proposition here. And when Jack McVeigh is the only guard out there that's hitting shots in these warm-up games, and he's someone who's done it over the course of an entire season, so you know that his body is primed to do this, you know that he's in some sort of rhythm, then there's a very legitimate argument to bring someone like him. Again, it was I think the thing that irked a lot of people was the idea of not bringing those specialists when you're not going to bring Matisse Thybulle, who's a specialist in his own right.
And it's fair.
Yeah, totally. And another thing on the Matisse thing, the word that I got was that he was surprised in the same way that everyone was surprised. It wasn't, from what I understood, he wasn't angry. He was sort of disappointed and hurt. He hung around for a little bit and then left on the weekend. But I don't see this as something that will create an ongoing resentment with the program. I think Matisse Thybulle has a fairly decent connection with the program and the players within it, that this isn't going to be for example, like a Ben Simmons thing where being left off one team creates resentment in the long term. I don't think that's going to be the case here. I know that Matisse Thybulle will be 30 by the time the next major tournament rolls around, and the potential of alienating your naturalized player is a risk, right? And Gorgon has taken this risk in multiple ways with Matisse Thybulle, with the guy who's about to coach in the Sydney Kings for the next 3 years, right?
That's the more interesting one. Let me say that, because you talk about Matisse Thybulle. When I said this, and when I said that I thought in the immediate aftermath of the World Cup last year, when I said, there might be a decision to make with Thybulle, that was my initial reaction. But I was talking about potentially another naturalized player that has been spoken about forever, people get annoyed about, that has a skill set that this team, in my opinion, desperately needs. But they didn't go down that path. We don't need to open that conversation again.
But he's not even naturalized, though. He's not Australian.
No. Who are you talking about?
You're talking about Bryce. You're talking about Bryce.
No. If they didn't go down the path, he wasn't eligible.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
But the Xavier Cooks. Now, Xavier Cooks is an unbelievable person. All that. I'm sure it's not going to be a problem. But if I was a fan of the Sydney Kings, I'd be like, what? What is this going to look like?
Yeah, it's and it's weird that when I first crossed paths with Gorge on Sunday, it was the first thing he said. He's like, I'm here to make unpopular decisions.
Yeah,
this is what we're here to, and
he owns it. He does own it.
Totally. And I saw a lot of people in my mentions saying, "Oh, Gorge is out after the Olympics." He knows.
Exactly.
He has flagged this ad nauseum. We know this by now. But I think the thing that shifted everything, and I don't know if enough people are pointing to this, is Jack McVeigh. Because Jack McVeigh obviously had a wildly impressive NBL season, championship series MVP, and then went into camp on day one, sent a message, right? He was really good on day one. It was the first thing that everyone told me, that Jack White's been really good. He's going to make a really tough decision. And then on day two, when media was allowed in, I saw the same thing, where Jack McVeigh came in and was just killing it, right? He was picking and popping, hitting shots, cutting to the rim, finding his spots within the Boomers offense. And then he obviously showed that in the first game as well. He had 24 points in 13 minutes, hit 6 threes. The interesting thing about the McVeigh pick was Matt Nielsen arrived late to camp, right? He had some travel issues coming back from the US, and so he wasn't there for the first few days. And so when he arrived and all the coaches were saying hey, Jack McVeigh is working his way onto this team, he's maybe part of the core by now. Matt Nielsen was skeptical. I think he came in and was like, really? Let's see. And then they Jack McVeigh kept showing it, went into that first game, and by then the entire coaching staff was in agreement that okay, we should probably bring this guy. Now, the Jack McVeigh pick put him into that core rotation. So theoretically, let's say there's 10 minutes there for Jack McVeigh. That cuts down Matisse Thybulle's minutes, who played, 14, 15 minutes at the World Cup?
Yeah.
Right? So that's one person coming into the rotation. Dyson Daniels didn't play at the World Cup. He's coming into the rotation. You have Jock Landale coming in, obviously, but there's a lot of minutes in that core rotation, which is generally 8 or 9 guys. That's the case for every team. That's now off the books. And now all of a sudden you have Jack McVeigh, who obviously can score in a multitude of ways, but now he's your designated shooter. All of a sudden, in the coaching staff's mind, I guess, you don't need Chris Goulding anymore because you have that shooter who they played at the 3, they played at the 4, so they played him across different positions.
Yep.
So then, we can go a different direction with that Chris Goulding pick. So then do we go into the toughness of Delhi, or do we go into that extra, the added layer of creation that Joe Ingles brings? So I think Jack McVeigh, because he sort of came out of nowhere and imprinted himself, not just in the team, but in the rotation, I think the carry-on effect of that, it followed that so many other decisions had to be made. And you could argue that this coaching staff thought a little bit too deeply about some positions and didn't just think Xavier Cooks is really good at this, and this, and that could be useful. And Matisse Thybulle is one of the best in the world at this thing, and it would be helpful to have that sort of thing as part of our group. Maybe they thought too deeply and said, we need toughness and grit, which again, those are not material things. Maybe they thought a little bit too deeply about it. But you can't say that they didn't think deeply. That you can't say that they didn't go through every single option they had.
No, that's exactly right. That's why I'm saying that you can make cases for different guys, and that's why I'm fascinated to now see they obviously have a vision. And while they picked this final squad, and I guess technically they didn't know, was it going to be Slovenia again? Was it going to be Greece? But we found out over the weekend. But I also don't think, and I asked Gorge about this going back about a month ago, can you pick specifically saying, okay, well, we're going to have Giannis? Now, I don't know how you ignore it, but he said that, well, we can't really afford to sit around and say, okay, individual matchups, because ultimately you're hoping you go further. But how they put this lineup together, how they work through the rotation is going to be interesting to me. Because as you said, there's a bunch of guys that are going to be creeping in for minutes. How much does Patty Mills play? I'm not sure. But I still think the biggest question for this Boomers team, and I hope they get out of the group, and I hope they make a run. It all looks absolutely terrifying when you look at the state of world basketball right now. There's no question about that. But I still think that and they admit this, but I think that it's a little bit of a hard pill, I think, for fans to swallow, is that you win the bronze medal in Tokyo, but you almost immediately walked into a transition period. And I think this is very much a transition period. And I look at the squad, and the squad is awesome. And for the first time almost ever, I think you're in a position where you're picking a basketball team, not just the most talented players. I don't know if Australia's ever been in that scenario. That maybe back in the day there was teams that were that way, but it's a very different situation. And I think coming up next, the big question and a big problem for this Boomers team, for me at least, is going to be, who are the scorers? Because when you look at last year's World Cup and Giddey was top scorer, Mills was right there, but we know Mills has come into the end of his national team period. Who's going to be the scorer? Because I don't think anyone looks at Josh Giddey and says, well, he's a world-class scorer to the level of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander that you're going to see, to Giannis that you're going to see, to Team USA next week. Now, you can't compare yourself to them, but have 10 guys that are primetime scorers. That's the big question when you look at the next group coming through. It is still very much a transition. This is a pretty young squad when you look at the core guys, but it's all fascinating to me. I guess the one thing I wanted to ask you, and you can finish my point there if you want, but the one thing I did want to ask you is, because I don't want it to all be negative as well, because there are so many good individual stories in this group. Is there one that stands out to you? Because as much as we can nitpick the squad and nitpick the players, it's a big deal for all of these guys. Some guys doing it multiple times, some guys for the first time. What stands out to you after being around?
It's the easy one. So I'll put it like this. 4 years ago, Jack McVeigh was a bit part player on Josh Giddey's Adelaide 36ers. Yes. That was 4 years ago, right? That was a year. That was the COVID year. That was a year before the Tokyo Olympics. That's what Jack McVeigh was. And he was out here shooting one-footed threes and letting his emotions get the better of him, and he let the mental part of his game take over the actual like the playing part of his game, and that really affected him. And we knew how talented he was. As a junior, he was one of the best in the country. It was him and Jonah Bolden as the top two dudes in that age bracket. And he dropped off a little bit. He had a horrible time in college, came to the NBL and was a bit part player. He was a role player. He was the 8th or 9th guy on that Josh Giddey Adelaide 36ers team. 4 years later, he's an NBL champion, an NBL Championship Series MVP, just got married, had to skip his honeymoon so he can be part of this Boomers camp. His wife, Beth, went to the honeymoon in Bali with a group of their friends. That's a really good idea. Firstly, it was a group honeymoon. So there were a lot of his friends, a lot of her friends, and they weren't going to cancel it. So they just went and did this.
Yeah. And shout out to Jack McVeigh, just putting the foot down early in the marriage. That is a smart man. And so it's a group honeymoon, which just turned into a group holiday because it didn't involve Jack. Mm-hmm. And Jack McVeigh went into Boomers camp and he lit it up. And he did exactly what he needed to do, made this team. 4 years ago, he was teammates with Josh Giddey on an Adelaide 36ers team that missed the playoffs. Now he's about to be teammates with Josh Giddey on an Australian Boomers team going to the Paris Olympics. That is one hell of a rise that you put down to obviously him putting hard work in, transforming his game, leaning into parts of his skill sets, tweaking the mental game and basically directing he has all of this energy and it's amped up, and he's been able to direct that into really effective output on a basketball court, and now he's about to be an Olympian. So that is probably the coolest part of this. And one of the coolest things you could see is some of the vision that's been floating around of Jack and Will Magnay being told that they're Boomers. And one of the coolest things was when Will Magnay was told, one of the first things he asked, which is very risky, he asked the coaching staff, did Jack make it? And they obviously said yes, and he was really excited about that. But that is also a really cool part of this. The two Jack jumpers, they're really close friends. Being part of this together, earning their spot on this team, I think that's my coolest story. No, very well said. And I was going to follow up with Will Magnay because just a guy that just wasn't able to get healthy over the last few years. And when you look at gets to the NBA, has a short period there, but when he signs with the Tassie Jack Jumpers, he's this marquee, big-time, game-changing big that's going to dominate the NBL. Now, as we've learned,
the question marks everywhere, though. You knew that, right? As in, is he even going to play? Can he play 5 minutes? Right?
Yep. And we've discussed Magnay. I don't know how many times on the podcast this year, because if you were like me and you're on the Jack Jumpers train for very early, you knew that Will Magnay was the wild card, and he felt like the difference for this team. He was the guy that could take them to the title. And I know Jack McVeigh won the MVP, but the utter defensive dominance of Will Magnay at times throughout this NBL season. You talk about long shots to make the Boomers squad. McVeigh would have been a long shot, no question. Daly would have been a long shot if you consider where he was at 2 years ago. That's a great story. And then Magnay, the other guy there, that you just wouldn't have thought that it could really happen, because you look at the depth in the big men for Australia. He can't get healthy anyway. So even halfway through this NBL season, when he was again struggling and missing games, you wouldn't have picked it. But timing was everything. And I do think, to your point, regardless of whether I thought they should have gone with a third center, I'm thrilled that he's in the squad, because I do believe that there will be game-changing moments in this tournament where he has a big block, or he maybe throws down a lob. He brings something a little bit different for this team. So there are some really good stories as well. And we didn't even get to Paddy and Joe, Olympics number 5 as well.
And Olympics number 5 for Lauren Jackson too. So absurd. Credit to all those guys. The Lauren Jackson story is the most absurd. But
the biggest difference with that is Lauren Jackson, her first Olympics was in 2000. Some of her teammates weren't even. Jade Melbourne was minus 2 years old when Lauren Jackson made her Olympics debut. Like, it just doesn't even make sense.
And the fact that the amount of time that she took off, and then the fact that Rudy Fernandez is about to play in his 6th Olympics, but his first Olympics was 2004.
Yes.
And I don't know what's more impressive, the fact that he's done all of those, or that Lauren Jackson did what she did was extremely effective on those teams, was the star of those teams. They achieved success, and then she just retired and then unretired and then went to the World Cup and then retired again and then unretired, and now she's going to the Paris Olympics. That's very, very cool. I want to touch real quick on the Magnay thing.
Yes.
Gorge has spoken a lot about going to the World Cup, where a lot of the guys who came into camp, a lot of those fringe guys, it was basically really happy to be here. Like, thanks for having me. Really good experience, et cetera, et cetera. That wasn't the case this time around. That team back then was so easy to pick. I've never seen an easier 12 to pick than that team that was in Cairns ahead of the World Cup. This one went down to a legitimate 15, 16 guys.
Yep.
And it was so tough to pick. And it was because these guys came in and they said, and Gorge says this, I'm effing making this team. Right? And that's what he liked. He liked that out of Jack McVeigh. He liked that out of Will Magnay and Delhi and all these guys. And the Magnay one, day one is when Gorge knew, like, we're going to take a third big. Day two, all I kept hearing was Magnay was really good today. He was blocking everything. The same was said about day three with Will Magnay. And so I don't know if he's going to play much, depending on the style that the Boomers want to go down. Do they start Dorpreeth at times? I'm not sure they do. Is the best case scenario that Will Magnay never plays, because you're hoping that Jock Landale and Dorpreeth are healthy and not in foul trouble and they take all those minutes at the 5? Sure. Or is Will Magnay someone who you can throw on Giannis or throw on any of these bigger bodies and just say, hey, go give your all, right? Magnay basically tore his hamstring off the bone during Game 5 of the NBL Championship Series. He will go and leave it all out there, right? He did that in the first few minutes of that game. He finished the game and had a poster dunk on JLA in the clutch down the stretch, was huge defensively. They like the toughness and what he brings on the court. He's someone who, again, there are guys who you think that their careers, not that they're over, but they'll never be what they once were because of injuries. And he was one. His injuries, for a moment, looked like they'd be debilitating and he'd never be back to being an elite guy. The fact that he's been able to overcome those and ultimately make this team is very cool. And the last thing I'll say is something that Gorge has been talking about both publicly and privately is, and he says it to the guys, this isn't the most talented team. As in, I didn't pick the most talented players. I picked the players that fit what we want to do here. So you look at Xavier Cooks and you look at Matisse Thybulle. Matisse Thybulle's a better basketball player than lots of the Boomers currently. Xavier Cooks is a better overall basketball player than a lot of the guys on this team, but the coaching staff didn't feel that their skill sets fit what this team needed to be, and that was the overarching thing. That's the underlying theme of why these guys didn't get picked, not because they're not good or anything like that. It was purely because they have certain spots they wanted to fill, and those skill sets didn't fit them, and other ones did.
Mate, this has been a really fun chat. I'm curious to get the feedback as well, perhaps with some of the ways that we've broken this down, of course, whether you're listening on the podcast form or we saw last week, alarmingly, for people at home, the full episode on the ESPN Australia YouTube. So if you want to see the backgrounds of our living rooms, feel free to go on YouTube. You can also comment there and get involved in the conversation, because ultimately we have these discussions and we want to get the feedback from fans and see how they're feeling, because there's a lot of emotion between this. And part of that is just because everyone wants to see this team do so well, and they've been so attached to the Australian basketball and Boomers program over the last decade. So we look forward to that. I mentioned already the Opal squad as well. They were dominant against the China team that is very, very highly ranked in the world. And this was an Opals team without the head coach and half the squad that are still over playing WNBA. So the New York Liberty, they come to Connecticut tomorrow. We're going to catch up with Sandy Brondello on Sports Center, and I'm going to go catch some WNBA action. But all of these WNBA stories, whether it is Izzy McBegor, who we know is already an all-star in the WNBA, Steph Talbot, who's had her injuries, Christy Wallace has had the knee problems, Jade Melbourne, a young star, Izzy Borlace just got drafted a couple of months ago, Beck Allen, who had the horrific injuries at the World Cup 2 years ago in Sydney. So there are plenty of good stories here as well. And we want to continue to cover the Opals, because while the Boomers, maybe we've got some question marks, the Opals, very optimistic, Olgun. I'm very optimistic about this squad. They look in absolutely great shape entering Paris, and hopefully making another charge and getting back to where that program belongs.
Yeah, and it was I felt bad because everyone got given their like oversized Qantas tickets.
Yes.
At that unveiling, but there was only like 5 girls there.
Yeah.
There was I think it was 5 or I don't know if I forget if it was 5 WNBA players or 7 WNBA players, but it was just underwhelming because Sandy Brondello wasn't there and the majority of the team wasn't there. But it was okay because Izzy Borlase was there and Lauren Jackson was there, so it was okay. And it's really good speaking to Lauren Jackson too, because she's got a ton of perspective, which is really cool. She knows what she is. She knows what she was, and she knows what she currently is, and what she has to do to help this team. And that's not necessarily be the star that she was years ago, and what she is playing for Albury in the NBL 1 right now. She knows that the role she has to play on and off the court to help this team. And she couldn't talk more highly of the culture of this team, which has rebounded in a significant way since the last Olympics. So yeah, that's very cool. I'm excited. I assume we're going to come back together next week and sort of go through the group for the Boomers, especially because obviously it's the pearl clutching has been odd because we sort of knew that this was what the group was probably going to be. We've known this for ages, but yeah, Australia, Canada, Spain, Greece. It is, I say group of death, but it's a group of death. It's a very difficult group. These are all teams that should probably be in the quarterfinals, and it's just a stacked group. So we're going to go through it. I don't think it's all doom and gloom for Australia like most people think it is, but it's going to be extremely, extremely tough.
Mate, I couldn't be any more fired up about it. So, as we said, very excited for everyone that is on the team there, and regardless of the debate we have and the conversations we can have, it's going to be fun. And I'm pretty sure everyone's going to be all in once we do get to Paris, not too far away, July 27th, Saturday night, 7 p.m., by the way, the opener for the Boomers. Not bad time zone. That's 11 a.m. local time in Paris. So we're in Lille. So I don't know how the players are going to go arriving to the arena at 8:30
They're not happy.
They're not happy.
They're not happy. No shoot around, early wake up. They've got an 11 a.m. and then I want to say it's a 1:30 p.m., 1:30 p.m. So this is back to those junior days, playing those morning and early afternoon games.
Very, very bizarre, but it is going to be good. And I'm glad you pointed the stories you had, Olgs, as we wrap up this podcast at espn.com.au. You've done an outstanding job over the last few weeks covering all the teams and bringing the stories, a story with Gorge, a story with LJ. Well worth a read if you have some spare time here over the next few days. Remember to keep it locked on ESPN. It is your home for hoops. This has been the ESPN Aussie Hoops Hour. Kane Pittman, Olgun. We'll speak to you in a few days' time.